Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for today's Arria-formula meeting on the treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees in Russia's war on Ukraine. As we approach the grim 3-year milestone of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the UK, and I know many others here, are deeply concerned by reports of systemic ill treatment of detainees, some of whom we will hear from today, as well as experts including Pablo de Graef from the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Among the most disturbing reports are those of torture. Reporting by the UN Human Rights Office, the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and the Moscow Mechanism have consistently detailed the ill treatment and torture of Ukrainian and prisoners of war by Russian authorities. In recent months, those assessments have only worsened. The Commission of Inquiry has concluded that Russia's use of torture against prisoners of war and civilian detainees amounts to crimes against humanity, and their reports are chilling. They include reports that detainees have been subject to beatings, psychological pressure, prolonged stress positions, and mock executions. The reports find that interrogations are often accompanied by the worst kinds of torture, including burns and rounds of electric shocks amplified by water. Sexual violence is the norm for detainees, both men and women, with prisoners of war enduring rape, attacks on genital organs, and threats of sexual mutilation and castration. The Commission of Inquiry has concluded that Russian authorities have violated both international humanitarian law and human rights law, and have committed torture as a crime against humanity. Additionally, the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's Office report that 147 prisoners of war have been executed by Russian forces since the start of the full-scale invasion. This is yet another violation of international humanitarian law. Russia has a responsibility to ensure prisoners of war and civilian detainees must be treated humanely under the 3rd and 4th Geneva Conventions. Colleagues, these are not isolated incidents by rogue officers. Testimonies gathered by the Commission of Inquiry reveal that Russian state services coordinated and enforced these violent practices. Evidence points towards a coordinated state policy which allows Russian officials to humiliate and punish Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war with impunity. Meanwhile, the reports highlight that the families of those detained are kept in the dark about the whereabouts of their loved ones who are enduring this violence. Those who are released must confront the grave psychological impact and a long and difficult road to reintegration. The Commission of Inquiry recognises the support given to those released by Ukraine to survivors and encourages continued medical and psychosocial support to all victims. The UK calls on Russia to uphold its international obligations towards all those individuals it has in detention, as we expect of every country currently engaged in conflict. In particular, we ask Russia to confirm the full names of all detainees under its control, where they're being held and on what grounds. We ask that the Russian Federation ensures the humane treatment of all those in detention and grants the ICRC unimpeded access to places of detention in line with the Geneva Conventions. Finally, we call on Russia to uphold its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law and to release all arbitrarily detained civilians as well as prisoners of war. Today, colleagues, we will hear the invaluable perspectives and experience of those who have survived the horrors of this reality. I'm joined by Valery Horishny, Nariman Jalal, Maxim Butkevich, to my right. Thank you all for joining us today. But first, I would like to turn to Pablo de Graef, a member of the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, to speak on the overall situation. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Madam President, distinguished President, Excellencies. Thank you for organizing this highly relevant and timely meeting and inviting the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine to brief the Council. I am also honored to be here with other briefers who have themselves been detained and endured grave violations and actively contribute to raising awareness about the situation of detainees. For over 2 mandates, the Commission has highlighted the wide array of violations and corresponding crimes in the framework of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, as well as their devastating impact on victims, their families, and communities. The Commission has reiterated repeatedly its deep concern regarding the widespread and systematic use of torture by the Russian Federation against civilians and prisoners of war. In our October 2024 report to the General Assembly, we concluded that the Russian authorities have committed torture as a coordinated state policy and hence crimes against humanity. We reached this conclusion after gathering evidence for over 2.5 years concerning multiple patterns in the way Russian authorities committed torture in all regions of Ukraine where they took control of territories and in detention facilities in 8 regions of the Russian Federation. We found that defense services and security forces of the Russian Federation have acted in a coordinated manner and according to a division of labor in the commission of torture. In well-established detention facilities, regular personnel of the Federal Penitentiary Service, known as FSIN, and its special purpose units, known as Spetsnaz, impose routine harsh practices designed to scare, break, humiliate, coerce, and punish detainees. A violent admissions procedure intended to terrify detainees upon arrival, recurrent beatings in various areas of detention facilities and on various parts of detainees' bodies, intrusive body searches, a prohibition to sit, stress positions, sleep deprivation, forced physical exercise, and prolonged nudity are among some routine practices of which we have evidence. Compliance with imposed rules is monitored through surveillance cameras, and severe collective punishment is imposed for any behavior perceived as a breach. These practices have been transposed from detention facilities in the Russian Federation to those that come under their authority in occupied areas of Ukraine. Multiple testimonies from former detainees demonstrated that the leadership of detention facilities or other high-ranking Russian authorities have ordered, encouraged, tolerated, or taken no action to stop such treatment. In addition, 3 former members of the FSIN, whom we managed to interview after they had left their service, referred to guidance by hierarchic superiors as to how Ukrainian prisoners should be treated. 2 of them recounted a commander who instructed personnel, quote, to work harshly and with no pity, close quote, on Ukrainian detainees. A third such interlocutor stated that the regional head of the medical unit had directed the doctors not to forget, quote, that prisoners are enemies, close quote. Interrogations aimed at extracting information or eliciting false confessions are generally led by personnel of the Federal Security Service, known as FSB, and in the presence of personnel of FSIN and Spetsnaz. We documented some of the most violent treatment during interrogations, including severe and repeated beatings, sessions of electric shocks with wires attached to various parts of the detainees' bodies, at times in combination with water to amplify the effects of the electricity, burns, and suffocation. Some categories of persons were targeted in particular during interrogations. Civilians accused of collaborating with the Ukrainian armed forces or authorities, prisoners of war from Mariupol or Western Ukraine, officers, and those not fluent in Russian. Another disturbing element is the recurrent use of sexual violence as a form of torture in detention facilities held by Russian authorities. In large detention facilities, detainees are subjected collectively to long periods of forced unity, intrusive body searches, and attacks on genital organs through beatings and electric shocks with tasers, including in the showers, as they are naked and wet. We also documented individual acts of rape and attempted rape, electric shocks using wires and burns to the genital area, castration, and sexual mutilation. Male former detainees reported intentional attacks on their reproductive organs. For instance, a perpetrator told a former detainee, and this is a quote, "I will beat everything out of you so you cannot make children," close quote. Others shared similar experiences. Medical care is generally denied in detention facilities, even in situations where detainees had serious, visible, or life-threatening injuries. In some instances, this led to death or severe and irreversible medical complications. After the blast that occurred in July 2022 in the well-known Olevnica colony, a blast in which dozens of Ukrainian soldiers were killed, Russian authorities did not provide necessary medical assistance to severely injured soldiers. Basic aid was provided by fellow co-detainees, while the leadership of the colony stood and watched as Ukrainian prisoners of war died from serious injuries. In some cases, medical personnel in detention facilities was even involved in committing negligent or abusive act against detainees in the Russian Federation in breach of their ethical standards. The denial of medical care demonstrates a further disregard by Russian authorities for the dignity and the rights of the detainees. Through such conduct, Russian authorities have, in addition, violated the International Humanitarian Law provision concerning the health and integrity of detainees. Distinguished President, Excellencies, now to one of the most painful parts of my statement, the profound and long-lasting impact of the violations on the victims and their families. Former prisoners described the severe physical and psychological consequences they have had to endure after recurrent torture, often with long-term complications, including disability. Many still suffer pain and trauma, citing broken bones and teeth, bleeding, swelling and infected or gangrened body parts, difficulties breathing, walking, and sleeping, poor eyesight, and damages to various organs. Some of the victims underwent or are still undergoing complex medical interventions. A former detainee told the Commission, and this is a quote, "No creature alive deserves to be treated like Russian street Ukrainians in their detention facilities." End of quote. But in addition to physical trauma, victims emphasized the grave psychological impact of the violations. Many have developed post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety, and some have attempted suicide. They mentioned suffering from memory loss, difficulties in communicating, resorting to drinking. Victims conveyed their constant fear of being detained again and of being subjected to the same ordeal. Many of the victims found their reintegration into social and even family life to be particularly challenging. Their situation has, in many cases, in addition, led to displacement, family separations, loss of jobs, and livelihoods. They communicated a desperate need for more comprehensive assistance and support in their reintegration efforts. The Commission has emphasized the importance of comprehensive and victim-centered accountability, which includes judicial and non-judicial measures. Non-judicial measures are paramount for the rehabilitation process of the victims and include truth, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Mental health and psychosocial support continues to be in urgent need of upscaling. Further, victims and their families have stressed their vital need for perpetrators to be punished in accordance with the law. Identifying and prosecuting perpetrators is key to ending the culture of impunity and may contribute to the victims' sense of justice. The Commission is ready to continue our investigations, and we are aware of the multiplicity of efforts carried out by many organizations in this regard. The Commission reiterates its call for coordination of the efforts on this important matter in order to achieve meaningful results. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. de Graef, and thank you and your Commission for the hard work in compiling your inquiry. I'm now going to give the floor to Valery Harishny, who is a former prisoner of war, who was part of the defense of Mariupol in 2022. And before that, he was the manager of an educational youth and national project, and also an English teacher. And you spent more than 2 years in Russian captivity. Thank you very much.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, first of all, I would like to thank all the co-hosts and co-sponsors of this meeting, delegations of the United Kingdom, United States, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. We truly appreciate your support. My name is Valery Horishny, and I am a reconnaissance specialist, instructor, and a senior surgeon in the 12th Special Forces Brigade Azov of the National Guard of Ukraine. I've been serving in the brigade since 2018 and participated in the defense of Mariupol in 2022 when Russians viciously invaded Ukraine. After 86 days of defense in total encirclement, we got an order from our president to go into captivity. Even though I'm thankful for saving my life and the lives of my brother in arms, the servicemen of the Azov Brigade are currently facing trials and receiving severe prison sentences, often to life sentences, accused of involvement in a terrorist organization solely for defending our homeland. Prisoners of war are not held in special camps as required by the Geneva Convention, but are instead kept in regular prisons in Russia and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. My fellow prisoners of war and I endured systematic torture during detention. It includes severe and inhumane treatment, brutal beatings, including lethal cases, electric shocks, and other forms of torture. The treatment we endured was both severe and inhumane, marked by brutal beatings, some so vicious that they became fatal to some of my fellow prisoners of war. Among them was Alexander Ishchenko, a soldier of the Azov Brigade who died a few months ago in Russian captivity in Rostov-on-Don due to severe torture. Forensic examination revealed multiple rib fractures and blunt chest trauma. For those who survived, these ordeals left not only deep physical scars, but also profound and enduring mental trauma. As per my own experience, the majority of our prisoners of war have been kept in little tiny cells where only a few people should have been kept. But no, there might be from 5 to 30 people. Every time a prisoner has to step out of a cell, he or she gets beaten by the Russian prison guards. They regularly use rubber batons, electricity like stun guns, and many other methods to break one's personality. Most of the time, they don't even need any information from you. They just enjoy torturing people. That's it. So they are just true sadists and torturers. To be honest, I've met some humane guards in Russian captivity, but it's a very rare exception there. The food is just horrible there. There is no nutritious food at all, only porridge, bread, a little bit of fish or meat, and tap water with rust, leading to many diseases. The legs of our prisoners rot. They have been suffering from tuberculosis and so on. Moreover, the amount of food is just ridiculous. There were long months when we got only up to 10 spoons of porridge and approximately 150 grams of bread a day. You can only imagine the state of a mind in such conditions. My normal weight is now 73 kilograms, and in some prisons back then, my weight went down to 50 kilograms. We've published a book, it's called Moscow Convention, and it's about the treatment of prisoners of war in Russian captivity. It reveals how Russia really implements international humanitarian law and includes first-hand testimonies from Prisoners of War. I have a few copies to share in case anyone needs it. I've also got photos of my comrades just after exchange, and you can judge by yourself if I'm telling you the truth just by looking at these photos right here. This is my comrade, Uncle Kola, his call sign was. All of these are my brother-in-arms from Mariupol, from Azov, and from other units of Ukraine. You can see, actually, I said before that the legs of our prisoners of war rot, and you can see right here. The only time I saw the International Red Cross Committee representatives in captivity was when some people entered our cell and we had to fall face down because such were the rules there. Then they said to stand up and to tell them if we got beaten regularly. Some of our guys said, yes, we do. And the next second we got beaten again. Those were not International Red Cross representatives at all. Those were just the same Russian guards who dressed like civilians, and it was like a very funny joke for them to like prank us or something. The massacre at the Olenivka prison that was mentioned before in the Russian-occupied Donetsk region stands as one of the gravest war crimes against prisoners of war. In late July 2022, 200 exclusively Azov servicemen were moved to a separate barrack within the prison, where on the night of July 28-29, an explosion killed over 53 and injured at least 139. Witness accounts and investigations are pointing to a planned internal explosion. I was in a cell with one of those guys who survived the massacre in Olenivka, and he told me that a day before, one of the guards came up to them and said, "You're screwed up today." They thought it was strange, but no one cared. Then the following night, our guys heard a loud explosion, and the next moment, everything was burning because of some liquid, like oil or something. Most of the people who were there died right away, and those who survived were taken to the Donetsk hospital. I would also like to share an investigation conducted by the Ukrainian non-governmental organization Media Initiative for Human Rights about Olenivka, which presents uncovered facts and testimonies from survivors. I've also have a few copies of these, so you can take a look at it. We strongly urge you to make every effort to facilitate the exchange of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Keep the issue of grave violations of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law by Russia on the agenda, applying international pressure on Russia to grant the United Nations and International Committee of Red Cross access to Ukrainian prisoners of war and demand an end to the criminal prosecution of prisoners of war. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harishny. I'm now going to give the floor to Nariman Jalal, who is a Crimean Tatar journalist and activist. He was also deputy chairman of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people and was sentenced, I believe, to 17 years in prison in 2022 in connection with an alleged gas pipeline sabotage case. I give you the floor, Mr. Jalal.
Thank you, Barbara. Your Excellencies, I spent 3 years in Russian prison because I publicly spoke out against Russia's occupation of Crimea. A week before my release, FSB officers came to see me in prison. One of them asked me, if you knew you could be arrested, then why didn't you leave? I remember how I answered with very emotionally. It was you who invaded my homeland. Why should I leave? Since 2014, I lived and worked in occupied Crimea. As a result of illegal and politically motivated persecution by the Russian occupation authorities, many activists and journalists, including myself, were arrested. Criminal cases were fabricated against us. Torture and abuse were used. The testimony of secret witnesses is used as evidence. At the same time, judges do not give an opportunity to refute their lies. As a result, political prisoners are deprived of the right to a justice. It is impossible to defend yourself when the judge and the prosecutor are in cahoots. They only create a formal appearance of justice. In prison, it is also often impossible to exercise rights. It is especially difficult to obtain medical care. I often had to write applications for an appointment with a doctor every day for a week. And often these applications remained unanswered. In one of the prisons, we were forbidden to sit on the bed. We had to sit on a bench or walk. This made my legs swell. In another prison, I just had to lay down on the floor because I had a fever, but the doctor never came. Without his permission, it was impossible to lay on the bed. The heels of Rustem Gugurik, Irina Danilovich, Galina Davgopolova, Ahmed Suleimanov, Tofik Abdulghaziyev, Timur Abdullayev, and many other political prisoners is in critical condition. I have personally experienced many of the trials that are part of the life of political prisoners. Bad food, lack of medical care, moral and physical humiliation and bullying. In the Simferopol prison, I and other prisoners were beaten, insulted, and forced to learn and sing the Russian anthem. But I did not have the opportunity to experience the cruel treatment and torture that other political prisoners personally told me about. 4 people, Asan and Aziz Akhtemov, Shevket Usinov and Eldar Odamanov, who were detained with me in September 2021, were tortured. They were brutally beaten, tortured with electric shocks, threatened to kill themselves and even their children. In prison, I met a Ukrainian from the Kherson region. He told me that the occupiers tortured his wife to force him to confess the crime. Another Ukrainian said that he and other prisoners were regularly beaten and then taken out to be shot. But the executors shot near the head and laughed. For them, it was fun. Also, it is important to achieve normal conditions for political prisoners and prisoners of war in Russian prisons. It is more important to eliminate the reason why they ended up there. Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and the occupation of our territory, including Crimea. Human rights activists named at least 218 Crimean political prisoners, of whom 132 are Crimean Tatars, which indicate targeted persecution of indigenous people. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of Ukrainian citizens in Crimea fell victim to political repression. Illegal mobilization caused thousands of people to leave their homeland. For the small indigenous Crimean Tatars people, this can be regarded as a true humanitarian catastrophe. My compatriots remain hostages of the Russian repressive regime, among them my family and friends. While Ukraine, with incredible efforts, achieves the release of several of its own citizens from Russian captivity, the number of hostages of Russian regime is only growing. The release of Ukrainian citizens, the stopping of any persecution in the occupied territories are possible only if Ukraine wins the fight for its own territorial integrity. Any attempts to allow Russia to retain the occupied Ukrainian territories, including Crimea, mean the continuation of its repressive policy against Ukrainian citizens, against Crimean Tatar people. Today, no Ukrainian citizen in Crimea can feel safe and be sure that he will be able to protect his rights and freedoms, his life, if necessary. Residents of Crimea are forced to live in an atmosphere of fear, a crisis to trust in each other, and are forced to take actions against their will under pressure from the occupation authority. I can list hundreds of violations of international humanitarian law that Russia is committing in the occupied territories now. You know about them yourself. I'm sure that you understand that such a situation cannot be left without the attention of the international community. But without real mechanisms for holding a country accountable, the implementation of international humanitarian law is impossible. You understand, the Ukraine and the Crimean Tatars need your support. They want to live freely and safely. Let's support the Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Jalal, for your testimony and your evidence. I'm now going to give the floor to Maxim Butkevich, who is a Ukrainian human rights defender, journalist, civic activist, and a military serviceman, best known for his work in supporting refugees and internally displaced peoples. You spent over 2 years in Russian captivity and was sentenced in March 2023 to 13 years in a strict regime colony on fabricated charges. Mr. Butkevich, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, my name is Maxim Butkevich, and currently I'm an officer of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, senior lieutenant at the 210th Separate Assault Regiment. And also I'm a member of the Expert Council of Ukrainian Human Rights Organization Center for Civil Liberties. For many years of my life, advocacy for and defense of human rights and civil liberties have been my life's main deed and meaning. I tried to assist refugees and asylum seekers as well as internally displaced persons. I tried to protest against instances of torture and inhuman treatment, and to fight against xenophobia and various forms of discrimination in Ukraine. I've never been a military-like person, protesting war and violence because they degrade human beings and deprive them of their humanity. On 24th of February 2022, when my country, Ukraine, was invaded by Russian army, when my city of Kiev was attacked from the air, I knew what it means in my area of work. I was dealing with human rights abuses in other countries, dealing with refugees and asylum seekers. I knew well about human rights abuses in Russia. I knew very well that if Russian Federation achieves its goals subjugating Ukraine, everything we've managed to create in previous years in human rights area would be erased, and human rights work in Ukraine would just cease to exist. Specifically because the occupying state demonstrated such a disregard for human rights and civil liberties before. we were put in a position where we had no other choice but to defend ourselves. And for me, it was also to defend human rights by taking up arms. So I joined Ukrainian armed forces. Within several months, when I was captured by Russian forces on 21st of June 2022, I've had a chance to find out what human rights in Russia really mean. This chance lasted for 2 years and 4 months, which I have spent as a prisoner of war under control of Russian Federation, until I was released in a prisoner of war exchange in October 2024. Here I think it is a good moment to thank all those human rights and civic activists, and also coordination headquarters for the treatment of POWs, who made my release possible. The next day after we were taken captive, some Russian officers told us that we are not prisoners of war. They told us that we just disappeared in the battle zone, and we will become POWs only when we are transported to our final destination point and registered. Quote, "This is when Geneva Convention will start applying to you," end of quote, they said. In the meantime, we have just disappeared. It might never reappear again if we are not doing what we are told by them. They were not telling the truth. Geneva Conventions never started to apply to us. For the first time, I was beaten on my way to Luhansk by an officer of Russian armed forces. He wanted prisoners of war to repeat after him quotes from Russian president's address regarding history of Ukraine. And if there was any slip of tongue or any pause, I, as the only officer and commander, received a blow with a wooden stick on my shoulder. So Vladimir Putin's version of Ukrainian history is written on my skin now. We were humiliated, threatened, forced to shout glory to Russia. And we traveled in, to put it very mildly, extremely uncomfortable conditions. Later on in prison, we were subjected to interrogations by different officers who never introduced themselves. Sometimes they used just threats. Sometimes there were proper interrogations, sometimes there were tortures. I was in the same cell with POWs who were beaten during interrogations, shocked by electricity, forced to record videos with prepared texts they had to voice about Ukrainian leadership, about the state of Ukraine, also incriminating themselves and their commanders. What I never expected was that they would try to fabricate a criminal case with fake charges against me, but they did. And that was another instance when physical force was applied to me. Later on, I've met several dozens of prisoners of war who were also forced to sign confessions about things they were not doing. I was explained with the use of violence, pain, and threats of sexual violence that I've got two options. Either I sign the confession that I have committed war crimes, and very soon I am sentenced and may be exchanged within few months. Or I will refuse and they will turn my life into a living hell or just shoot me. And they also said that there is no oversight over them. And I knew that at this, they were right. No one had access to us. No one could properly monitor what kind of conditions we were held in, not being fed properly without the basic standards of hygiene being upheld, not taken out for walks, but kept all the time inside the cell. This is when I signed papers without reading them, because I was not allowed to. My whole so-called criminal case was based upon my confessions only, and that is prohibited by Russian legislation, but they never cared. And they also told me that, you know, the court will find you guilty no matter what, because Russian courts, they said, take decisions necessary for the Russian state. In March 2023, I was sentenced to 13 years of strict penal colony for breaching Geneva Conventions. This was the second time in captivity I've heard these words, but this time there were Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of civilian population. I was transferred to the penal colony in Luhansk region, where I came across dozens of other Ukrainian POWs sentenced on fake charges, and almost all of us shared the same story, which goes like this. Russian forces besieging a city or a town were shelling it with their artillery, injuring and killing civilians. And then, after taking the town over, they found victims of this shelling and blamed their injuries and deaths upon Ukrainian prisoners of war. I also came across civilians who found themselves in captivity, some of them sentenced on fabricated cases, others imprisoned for cooperation with the country of their nationality, Ukraine, and all of them tortured. Some others were under so-called preventive arrest, meaning they used to work before for Ukrainian law enforcement organizations, central or local self-governance, or used to serve in Ukrainian military. And they were not accused of anything, just kept in jail, and no one knew where they are. They have simply disappeared. I'm talking about thousands of people whose whereabouts are unknown. Torture, mistreatment, inhumane and degrading treatment, absence of fresh air and sunlight, excessive physical exercises, beatings and electric shock, forced confessions, forced statements recorded on videos, lack or quite often total absence of medical care, bad food, hard work while already in the colony. This is what was applied to Ukrainian prisoners of war and illegally detained civilians. I was a witness in that. They were not isolated cases. It was a system where Russian so-called investigators, guards, and collaborators from the occupied territories received orders from the above. Before leaving to the front line in the east of Ukraine, I left a message to the local school kids, quoting the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All people are born free and equal in dignity and rights and should treat each other in the spirit of brotherhood. Nowadays, our contemporary world takes it as a nice but idealistic text. Well, it is not. It is still valuable. I truly believe it. And I've seen that everything the Russian Federation does goes exactly against it, constantly undermining this very principle, turning international humanitarian law and specifically Geneva Conventions into a joke by using it only for sentencing prisoners of war on made-up charges. So I kindly ask you to make all the efforts possible and necessary to ensure quick release of Ukrainian prisoners of war and illegally detained civilians before anything else. And in the meantime, to establish proper, independent, international monitoring mechanism of the detention facilities where they are held. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bukevich, for your testimony and for sharing your story with us. I want to say again, thank you to all of our briefers. Do you want to add something, Mr. Gerard? No, okay, thank you. I want to thank all of our briefers today. This has been a very powerful session of testimony, and I'm now going to give the floor to member states who wish to make statements, starting with the United States. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to thank Pablo de sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank Mr. Pablo de Grave from the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and also honor our other briefers, Valerie Harishny, Nariman Djel, and Maxim Butkevich for sharing your own harrowing experiences in Russian captivity and also what you observed. Madam Chair, as today's briefers remind us, the number of independent and credible reports by international observers are overwhelming in detailing the inhumane treatment of Ukrainian civilian detainees and prisoners of war by Russia. The Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, in its most recent report, found that Russia's use of torture against detained Ukrainians has been widespread and systematic, amounting to a coordinated state policy. The Commission concluded Russian authorities had committed the crime against humanity of torture in the context of their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Evidence of Russia's crimes are available to us thanks to the essential reporting from the Commission of Inquiry, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, the OSCE's Moscow Mechanism Experts Mission, and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, Ukrainian civil society organizations, and a variety of NGOs and other outside experts. The evidence is overwhelming. Their reports document Russia's abuses against detained Ukrainians to include physical, psychological, and sexual torture. The United States has credible evidence that Russia systematically holds detainees incommunicado, often without access to adequate food, sanitation, or medical services. We have credible evidence detainees face inhumane treatment and abuse for displaying any form of national pride or for refusing to swear allegiance to Russia. The United States assesses Russian forces continue to regularly torture and kill Ukrainian POWs, and we have seen an increase in reports of Ukrainian POW executions over the past year. In September and October alone, we estimate Russian troops executed 40 Ukrainian prisoners of war along the front line in Ukraine and in Kursk Oblast. The executions include shooting surrendering Ukrainian forces at close range and the brutality of beheadings and dismemberments. Madam Chair, I fear we run the risk of becoming desensitized to these revelations. For years, we have heard unrelenting testimony of Russia's shocking abuses and atrocities. We must not lose sight of how reprehensible and unacceptable they are. So long as Russia continues this course, the international community must not do business as usual with the Russian Federation. The United States will continue to support Ukraine and to hold Russia and Russian officials to account for their unlawful actions. We commend the members of the Security Council who have endeavored to hold Russia to account for its actions. Speaking up in this forum on behalf of the UN Charter and International Humanitarian Law demonstrates global leadership and makes the world safer. We have also heard some members of the Council, however, make statements that provide Russia with political cover. Such statements enable Russia's transgressions and make it difficult to take these members seriously as global leaders. As Ukrainians fight to defend their country and their families from the horrors of Russia's crimes, telling Ukrainians to meet Russia halfway or take seriously Russia's legitimate security concerns is absurd, and it is wrong. A victim should never be told to meet their aggressor halfway. There is no equivalency in this conflict. Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim. So let us not engage in false equivalency. The Russian Federation must immediately cease its war of choice and its ill treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees, including torture and summary executions. Russia must hear and heed our calls to allow international humanitarian organizations access to POWs and civilian detainees, consistent with its obligations under the Geneva Conventions. The United States condemns Russia's appalling abuses against POWs and detained civilians, which strike at the heart of the United Nations mission of protecting the people of the world from the scourge of war. As UN Security Council members, we must insist on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We must work together to bring Russia's unlawful invasion to an end and to support Ukraine in its pursuit of a comprehensive, just, and sustainable peace consistent with UN Charter principles. Let me underscore that any peace must adhere to the principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. To be sustainable, peace must fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity with its internationally recognized borders, as well as to Ukraine's sovereignty and political independence. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Señora Presidenta, agradecemos a los copatrocinadores por la organización de este evento. Agradecemos la participación de Pablo de Grief, miembro de la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre Ucrania, por su detallada exposición, así como a los expositores invitados que nos acompañan, cuyos testimonios informan sobre dramáticas violaciones del derecho internacional humanitario en este contexto. Desde el inicio de la invasión a Ucrania, Panamá, fiel a su vocación pacifista, multilateralista y respetuosa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, ha expresado la necesidad imperiosa de redoblar esfuerzos para lograr una paz general, justa y duradera en Ucrania. En este amplio contexto, desde el inicio del conflicto, Panamá ha sido enfática en el respeto de la soberanía, la independencia política e integridad territorial de Ucrania, con fundamento en el derecho internacional y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, tal como se advierte en el comunicado emitido por el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores de Panamá del 24 de febrero de 2022. En este sentido, y considerando el informe presentado por la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre Ucrania en octubre de 2024, que se refiere a las torturas cometidas por parte de autoridades rusas contra prisioneros de guerra y detenidos civiles ucranianos, hacemos un llamado a la obligación ineludible de salvaguardar las debidas garantías aplicables de conformidad con el derecho internacional humanitario y los derechos humanos. Cabe resaltar el reciente apoyo de Panamá a la resolución 79/184 de la Asamblea General, que insta a la Federación Rusa a garantizar las condiciones adecuadas para la detención de los prisioneros de guerra ucranianos de conformidad con los requisitos del Convenio de Ginebra relativo al trato debido a los prisioneros de guerra de 1949. Asimismo, Panamá es signataria de la Declaración de Paz de la Cumbre de Paz para Ucrania, celebrada en Suiza en junio de 2024. Dicha declaración contiene 3 puntos relevantes: la seguridad nuclear, el tránsito marítimo seguro en relación con la seguridad alimentaria y la liberación de los prisioneros de la guerra en Ucrania, incluyendo el retorno de los niños y otros civiles secuestrados. Este tercer punto de la declaración de gran alcance humanitario hace precisamente un llamamiento a la liberación de todos los prisioneros de guerra a través de una operación de intercambio entre las partes en conflicto, respectivamente. En noviembre del año pasado, Panamá participó en la conferencia ministerial sobre la dimensión humana de la fórmula de paz de 10 puntos de Ucrania, de donde surgió el llamado Compromiso de Montreal, medidas concretas para ayudar al retorno de prisioneros de guerra, civiles detenidos ilegalmente y niños deportados, incluido el apoyo a medida que estas personas se reintegran a una vida normal. Panamá reitera su enérgica condena a todas las formas de violencia en el contexto de los conflictos en Ucrania y en cualquier otro, y destaca la necesidad urgente de garantizar justicia para las víctimas. Entre febrero de 2022 y agosto de 2024, la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos documentó 342 casos de violencia sexual perpetrada por miembros de las Fuerzas Armadas y autoridades rusas, afectando a hombres, mujeres, niñas y niños. Según el informe, la mayoría de esos actos se llevaron a cabo contra población civil, prisioneros de guerra y personal retenido en centros de detención, lo que subraya la gravedad de la situación y la necesidad de acciones inmediatas para evitar la impunidad y garantizar el acceso a la justicia para las víctimas. En este sentido, instamos a que se fortalezcan los esfuerzos para garantizar que todas las víctimas de violencia sexual en cualquier conflicto armado, especialmente las mujeres combatientes y prisioneras de guerra, quienes enfrentan múltiples formas de vulnerabilidad tengan acceso a una asistencia integral, incluidas medidas de apoyo a la reintegración social y la reparación de los daños sufridos, así como la plena rehabilitación, en línea con la resolución Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad. Panamá reafirma la obligación ineludible de salvaguardar las debidas garantías para que los prisioneros de guerra sean siempre protegidos de la violencia, reciban las atenciones de salud correspondientes y que se permita el acceso del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja con el fin de garantizar el pleno goce de sus derechos. Ante esta situación, instamos a las partes a cumplir estrictamente sus obligaciones en virtud del derecho internacional humanitario, advirtiendo que su incumplimiento reiterado tendría un impacto grave e impredecible en la paz y la seguridad global. La guerra en Ucrania se ha prolongado por 3 años, con más de 12.300 civiles fallecidos, de los cuales 650 son niños. Es imperativo un camino hacia la paz por la vía diplomática. Estas cifras, que no dejan de ser alarmantes, nos obligan a hacer un llamado como país mediador y comprometido con la protección del derecho internacional humanitario y de los derechos humanos sobre la base de los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Когда мы узнали о планах проведения данного мероприятия, мы рассчитывали, что данная серьезная гуманитарная проблема будет затронута организаторами во всей ее совокупности. И уж что во всяком случае не будут обойдены вниманием вопросы нарушения МГП в отношении находящихся в украинском плену российских военнослужащих. Тем более, что даже УВКПЧ уже не может игнорировать жестокость киевского режима. Так, в последнем докладе управления, опубликованном 31 декабря прошлого года, говорится, что за период с 1 сентября по 30 ноября было опрошено 25 российских военнопленных в украинских местах содержания. Все, кроме одного, сообщили, что в 2024 году подвергались пыткам или жестокому обращению на одном или нескольких этапах пребывания в плену. 14 из них подверглись сексуальному насилию. И это при том, что российские военнослужащие опрашивались, находясь во власти врага, и, соответственно, не могли свободно давать показания. И тем не менее, они с риском для жизни не стали подыгрывать своим мучителям. И, разумеется, никто из сегодняшних докладчиков или государств, организовавших Арию, не упомянул о том, что российские военнослужащие, попавшие в руки Киева, подвергаются жестоким пыткам и издевательствам. За доказательствами далеко ходить не надо. Неонацисты открыто выкладывают в интернет видеосвидетельства своих преступлений, на которых кастрируют пленных, простреливают им колени, раненых добивают выстрелами в голову. Над трупами глумятся, выкалывают глаза, записывают видео, обращенные к родственникам убитых. Это видят все, кроме наших избирательно слепых и глухих западных коллег. Акцент сегодняшнего мероприятия предсказуемо делается на якобы нарушениях в отношении попавших в плен солдат ВСУ, которые, как известно, опрашиваются после возвращения на Украину и, разумеется, держат в уме необходимость ориентироваться на инструктаж своих спецслужб о том, какие именно они должны давать ответы. И это при том, что права украинских военнопленных соблюдаются. К ним осуществляется доступ сотрудников Международного комитета Красного Креста, как это предусмотрено его мандатом. По данному вопросу, а также по другим аспектам, связанным с указанной категорией лиц, налажено эффективное взаимодействие между комитетом и Минобороны России. Кстати сказать, если бы западные коллеги ставили перед собой задачу быть хоть в чем-то объективными, они бы упомянули о том, что по состоянию на начало декабря прошлого года Украина отказывалась забирать 630 своих военнопленных, список которых был нами опубликован. Эти люди, многие из которых были направлены на фронт в результате принудительной мобилизации и которые могут рассказать правду о том, как с ними обращались в России, киевскому режиму не нужны. На обмен там требуют только отъявленных неонацистов и неофашистов, которые будут говорить в СМИ то, что нужно просроченному клоуну Зеленскому и его клике. Что касается ситуации с гражданскими лицами, то устроители Арии лицемерно оставили за скобками судьбу тех из них, кого преследуют на Украине за политические взгляды, а таковых тысячи, если не десятки тысяч. Сами украинцы открыто называют свою страну концлагерем имени Зеленского. Чтобы понять это, достаточно вспомнить о судьбе украинской правозащитницы Елены Бережной, которая известна своей последовательной антифашистской позицией и бескомпромиссной борьбой за права человека. Она, как известно, дистанционно участвовала в заседаниях Совета Безопасности ООН, и потому ее судьба должна особо отслеживаться членами Совета, как лица, которому на родине могут быть применены меры воздействия за изложение своей позиции. Ее арестовали 16 марта 2022 года. С тех пор она содержалась в тюрьме Службы безопасности Украины, и с ней не было никакой связи. По имеющейся информации, все это время пожилую 70-летнюю женщину пытали, пытаясь заставить изменить свою позицию. Но она не сдалась. В итоге 10 декабря прошлого года, в День прав человека, украинский суд вынес Елене Бережной приговор 14 лет тюрьмы с конфискацией имущества. Причем едва ли не ключевым элементом приговора стало письмо, направленное ею в Генассамблею ООН в 2022 году и зачитанное с ее трибуны постпредом России. Мы сразу же информировали об этом коллег в ходе заседания Совета Безопасности ООН. И что же, хоть кто-то из наших западных коллег сказал об этом сегодня? Или, может быть, скажет? Лучшего свидетельства вашего лицемерия и безразличия к судьбам украинцев, коллеги, даже сложно себе представить. Понятно, что сегодняшнее неформальное заседание Совета изначально задумывалось как антироссийское пропагандистское мероприятие, и было бы наивно ожидать сегодня услышать хоть слово правды от устроителей и подобранных ими докладчиков. Тем более, что среди них есть отъявленные ненацисты, в частности Валерий Горишный, служивший в полку Азов, признанном в России террористической организацией и, кстати, признававшимся таковым до недавнего времени в США. Как следует из соцсетей, Горишный имеет татуировку в виде эмблемы дивизии СС «Мертвая голова» Topical и является большим поклонником этой танковой дивизии СС. Для заинтересовавшихся оставим несколько цветных фотографий, подтверждающих этот факт. Напомню коллегам, что 14-я рота этого подразделения в марте 1940 года совершила убийство британских военнопленных в деревне Ле-Парадис во Франции. Тогда были казнены 97 человек. Это исторический факт, о котором не могут не знать наши британские коллеги. Однако стыдливо умалчивают об этом. Когда я лично в мае 2022 года рассказал об этом в прямом эфире британского телеканала Sky News, ведущий торопливо прервал меня, боясь, что эта информация разойдется в Великобритании. Надеюсь, что после сегодняшнего мероприятия в этой стране широко разойдется информация о том, что британские дипломаты, организаторы сегодняшнего мероприятия, приглашают выступить в ООН человека, прославляющего нацистских преступников, убивших их соотечественников. Это все, что нужно знать о моральных принципах современной западной дипломатии. Кроме того, одним из основных докладчиков является эксперт так называемой независимой международной комиссии по расследованию событий на Украине. Как мы уже неоднократно подчеркивали, Российская Федерация не признает этот политизированный и не заслуживающий никакого доверия механизм, который получает лживую информацию от Киева и занимается распространением с использованием логотипа ООН. Решительно отвергаем все обвинения и выводы, содержащиеся в докладах комиссии, поскольку они базируются на лжи и тотальном искажении фактов. Коллеги, не делайте ошибки. Сегодняшнее пропагандистское антироссийское шоу никоим образом не направлено на выяснение правды о том, какое отношение проявляется к военнопленным. В этом плане оно идет в русле других антироссийских провокаций, состряпанных при помощи наших британских коллег. В частности, отвратительной постановки в Буче, применительно к которой секретариат ООН вот уже 2 года не может оказать нам содействие в получении поименного списка жертв. Благодарю за внимание.
I take note of Russia's statement. We are disappointed, but not surprised, to hear that they are unwilling to reflect in any way on the evidence presented today of their brutal mistreatment of prisoners. I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank the United Kingdom for convening this important meeting, as well as the briefers for the invaluable yet sobering accounts. I would also like to commend the OHHR, as well as the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, for their excellent work. The latest reports reveal the harrowing truth regarding the violation of international humanitarian law and the human rights of the Ukrainian people by the aggressor state Russia, and the worsening of these violations across the board. Civilian casualties have now exceeded 40,000. Quite strikingly, there is now evidence that torture is being systematically used against civilians and prisoners of war by the Russian authorities in a coordinated manner, thus amounting to potential crime against humanity. Since August 2024, credible allegations of execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war have increased exponentially. Madam President, I would like to stress Greece's clear and principled stance on the need to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law as fundamental pillars of international law. Greece, as a party to the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, as well as to the first additional protocol, condemns in the strongest terms the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees by the Russian armed forces and Russian occupying authorities in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We also call on Russia to ensure unfettered humanitarian access to POWs and civilian detainees and cooperate fully with all international monitoring and investigative bodies. In the same vein, Greece has signed the Montreal Pledge, adopted at the Ministerial Conference of the Human Dimension of Ukraine's Peace Formula last October, for the return of deported children and prisoners of war. In this spirit, we welcome the latest exchange of prisoners of war, which took place on 30 December 2024 under UAE mediation. We encourage all sides to continue with their positive steps in full compliance with international humanitarian law. Furthermore, it is crucial that we ensure accountability, and we support international efforts in this regard. We firmly believe that violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes committed inter alia against prisoners of war and civilian detainees should be thoroughly investigated by the relevant international institutions and the perpetrators be brought to justice. Madam President, in view of these violations, we cannot but stress the fundamental premise of the UN Charter, the prohibition of the use or the threat of use of force. Greece's foreign policy has always been defined by its commitment and adherence to international law. Let us therefore reiterate a consistent approach since the very beginning, a resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression, which constituted a manifest violation of the UN Charter and a serious threat to European security as well to global peace and stability. We also reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and its inherent right of self-defense against the Russian aggressions as enshrined on Article 51 of the UN Charter. Madam President, Greece remains committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, along with its partners and allies. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
My delegation takes note of the respective statements delivered by the briefers. Next month will mark 3 years since the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine. It is highly unfortunate that the conflict in Ukraine has continued to rage with devastating consequences for the region and beyond. We remain concerned about the impact of the ongoing conflict on civilians and civil infrastructure in the conflict zone. We reiterate our call for an early cessation of hostilities and the resolution to this conflict through dialogue and diplomacy based on the UN Charter and its principles. Madam Chair, the Third Geneva Convention related to the treatment of prisoners of war makes it binding on all parties to the conflict to abide by their obligations under the Convention. My delegation would like to advocate for strict adherence to obligations related to the treatment of POWs as stipulated by the relevant convention. We would like to also commend the mediation efforts and the role played by the United Arab Emirates in facilitating the exchange of prisoners of war from both sides. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
And I would like to extend my deep gratitude to all our briefers today. Your courageous testimonies demand our collective attention and action. We also thank the UK, US, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania for organizing today's meeting and casting a light on this tragic issue. Too often in this building, our discussions become detached from the harshest realities of conflict. Victims are reduced to mere numbers in a report. When this happens, the victim's suffering is diminished, becoming part of a broader trend or pattern. Today's topic is therefore an important opportunity to reflect on the human dimension of this horrible war. Madam Chair, Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, now nearing its grim 3-year mark, continuously exposes Ukrainian civilians to the risk of detention. Thousands of Ukrainians are currently detained, children as well as adults. The world cannot and must not look away. Let me recall that Russia has the ability to end this human suffering today. It simply requires pulling its forces out of Ukraine and ending its senseless attacks on the Ukrainian people. Madam Chair, it is in time of crisis and conflict that our commitment to international law stands the ultimate test. Human suffering may be widespread in times of war, but we are always obliged to do our utmost to minimize it. The Geneva Conventions clearly outline how. Denmark is deeply concerned with the treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees in this brutal war. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry has shed light on how Russian authorities have used torture against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war in the context of their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It also shows how sexual violence as a form of torture has been prevalent in detention facilities used by Russian authorities. OHCSR, in its latest report, has recorded a significant increase in credible allegations of executions of Ukrainian service persons captured by Russian armed forces since August 2024. Denmark reiterates that international humanitarian law, including the Third Geneva Convention, must be fully respected. This includes granting prisoner of war status to all persons fulfilling the criteria. Today, we've heard 3 harrowing accounts. We remain appalled by the continuing reports of heinous breaches of international humanitarian law perpetrated by Russia. It is almost a truism, but astoundingly it bears repeating today. Prisoners of war must be humanely treated at all times by all parties. They must be given the right to communicate with the ICRC, with their family, and they must enjoy protection of their status in all other respects. Madam Chair, let me reiterate Denmark's support for Ukraine's peace formula, which we believe can pave the way to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. The human dimension of this formula, including the safe return of prisoners of war and unlawfully detained civilians, is critical. To conclude, Denmark will not relent in our support for Ukraine's fight to protect its people and its sovereignty. We'll continue to call out Russia's breaches of the UN Charter and international law and urge all other members of these organizations to do the same. We'll make sure that also in this building, the fate of the thousands of Ukrainian civil detainees and prisoners of war are not forgotten. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I extend my gratitude to UK for organizing today's important meeting. I also thank the briefers for their sobering remarks. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine almost 3 years ago, in blatant violation of the UN Charter, the international community has been appalled by the degradation of human dignity and gross violation of human rights. In this regard, it is meaningful for the international community to address the issue of prisoners of war and detainees, which vividly demonstrate the extreme brutality of this illegal war. We are particularly shaken by the recent reports of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by the UN Human Rights Council, which revealed harrowing details of extremely disturbing ill treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war and detainees, including torture, summary executions, and sexual violences. It is quite notable that the COI concluded in its October report to the UNGA that the systematic and the widespread abuse of torture by the Russian authorities amounts to crimes against humanity. This conclusion was based on the COI's thorough deliberation on evidence supporting that Russia acted pursuant to a coordinated state policy involving organization and a division of labor among different authorities. My delegation takes this opportunity to appreciate the COI's achievements since its establishment in March 2022 in investigating violations and abuse of human rights, violation of international humanitarian law, and related crimes in the context of the aggression against Ukraine by the Russian Federation. We believe the COI's activities will lay important groundwork for the international community to hold those responsible for all atrocities committed during this war accountable. Madam Chair, Russia's illegal invasion has already caused unbearable suffering for the people of Ukraine, and its impacts keep reverberating across the global community. Moreover, now we are witnessing that the war in Ukraine bears inseparable security implications on our own region, as North Korean troops have been dispatched to support Russia's act of aggression in its illegal war since last year. We pointed out at the Security Council meeting last week that the DPRK sacrifices its troops in Russia to raise money for its regime and secure advanced military technology from Russia. Russia and North Korea still do not acknowledge the dispatch of North Korean soldiers to Russia, but North Korean engagement in the battle there is clear. Given the testimonies of the 2 North Korean soldiers captured by Ukraine's military in the Kursk Oblast. These 2 wounded North Korean soldiers indicated that they were even unaware of being deployed for the war against Ukraine. And North Korean troops have even been told by Pyongyang to kill themselves rather than be captured alive. Why? Why so? Why they want to hide out the simple fact that they are there? The answer is clear. Because this war is illegal. Because these military collusions between DPRK and Russia is illegal and immoral. We estimate the North Korean troops are currently sustaining significant casualties, with more than 300 soldiers killed and 2,700 injured from a total of 11,000 soldiers dispatched to Russia. The international community must not forget the fact that the blood of these North Korean soldiers is crying out from the ground. And we will continue to raise these issues again and again in the future. Madam Chair, as we are approaching the 3rd anniversary since this unjustifiable war began, we renew our sincere hope the Ukrainians will witness a restoration of human dignity this year. To this end, Russia must cease this war by immediately withdrawing its troops from the international recognized borders of Ukraine. Until the war ends, the international community should relentlessly condemn all atrocities, promote accountability in the face of impunity, and support those who were affected by such crimes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Chair. I'd like to thank you and the co-sponsors for organizing today's meeting. I also wish to thank the briefers, and I take note of their statements. Mr. Chair, Slovenia is gravely concerned with Russia's violations of international humanitarian and human rights law perpetrated during its war of aggression against Ukraine. And as underlined by Mr. Grave today, we are particularly concerned over the findings of the Commission of Inquiry on Russia's widespread and systematic use of torture against Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees. The use of sexual violence as a form of torture is distressing, to say the least, And most disturbingly, it seems that these appalling acts were committed pursuant to a coordinated state policy. They amount to crimes against humanity. We underline the importance of assessing the conditions in which detainees and prisoners are held and call on Russia to ensure unrestricted access to the ICRC and other independent monitors. Moreover, since August of last year, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded an alarming increase in credible reports of executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Since the war started, the OHCHR also verified summary executions of 170 civilians in areas controlled by Russia. Slovenia condemns these acts in the strongest possible terms. Mr. Chair, international law is clear and the international humanitarian law is clear. Such practices must cease immediately. Let me also touch upon reports of instances in which Russian prisoners of war have been subjected to torture and ill treatment. We understand that these incidents are already under the investigation by relevant national authorities. We wish to recall that the international humanitarian law is equally applicable to any warring party, and all such violations need to come to immediate stop. Slovenia underlines that all acts of torture, ill treatment, and executions of prisoners of war are unacceptable. We also call on Russia and Ukraine to continue with the practice of prisoners' exchange. At the same time, the lack of accountability for maltreatment of civilian detainees and prisoners of war needs to be addressed, regardless of the perpetrator. We advocate for victims and survivors to have a central role in these processes and continue to call for timely, effective, and comprehensive accountability measures. In this context, Slovenia supports the activities of the International Criminal Court. Mr. Chair, there will be no lasting peace for Ukraine without ensuring accountability for violations of international law committed during this war. Impunity needs to end, and justice needs to be brought to all victims of this war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you.
Over the past 3 years, we have rightly placed significant focus on the impacts of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine on civilians, recognizing its devastating toll on the lives and livelihoods of millions of civilians and the magnitude of the displacement crisis created. Today's meeting allows us to place the spotlight on another aspect of this conflict, which deserves attention. That is the abuse and ill treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees in violation of international humanitarian law. Guyana thanks the United Kingdom and its partners for organizing this meeting. We also thank the briefers for their statements. Chair, in its assessment of the overall scope and scale of torture and ill treatment experienced by prisoners of war since February 2022, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has documented reports of prisoners of war held on both sides being subjected to torture and ill treatment. Their latest report for the period September to November 2024, published 2 weeks ago, indicates that OHCHR has also recorded a significant increase in credible allegations of executions of Ukrainian service persons captured by Russian armed forces, involving at least 62 individuals in 19 incidents. In addition, OHCHR has documented the death in custody in a transit location of one Russian prisoner of war and continues to follow up on credible allegations of the deaths of 2 other men in the same location resulting from torture. In light of these concerning reports, Guyana reminds that international humanitarian law is explicit in defining the rights and protections that must be afforded to prisoners of war and other detained persons in armed conflict. Paramount among these are the legal provisions related to the humane treatment of such prisoners. We demand that the parties to this conflict uphold and fully comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and ensure that prisoners of war
and other detainees are not subjected to torture or other inhumane, indecent, or degrading treatment. Wounded or ill prisoners of war must be provided with the same medical care that is given to the members of armed forces of the detaining power in line with the provisions of the Third Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. We further call upon the parties to the conflict to grant unhindered access to all prisoners of war and civilian detainees so that cases and allegations of violations can be assessed and investigated. Parties must meet their obligations under the Geneva Conventions to give the International Committee of the Red Cross access to all detention sites where prisoners of war and civilians are being held. We underscore that detained civilians are not military combatants and cannot be classified as prisoners of war. International law is clear. Civilians should not be detained arbitrarily as a form of punishment or to be used for bargaining. Guyana condemns in the strongest terms all violations of international law, including with regard to the rights of prisoners of war and civilian detainees. We emphasize the importance of justice and accountability for all crimes committed during this war and for all those responsible for such crimes to be held accountable for their actions. Chair, Guyana commends the recent exchange of prisoners between Russia and Ukraine on 30th December 2024. We note that it was the 59th one of the largest such exchanges since the start of the war. We thank the countries that were instrumental in brokering the deal and urge Russia and Ukraine to continue to pursue and accelerate the release of prisoners of war and civilian detainees. In closing, Chair, Guyana reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. We remain committed to the pursuit of a peaceful resolution to the conflict and insist that this must remain the primary focus of the Security Council or a priority of the Council. We urge the parties to pursue dialogue and pave a path to peace by bringing an end to this devastating war once and for all. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Je remercie le Royaume-Uni pour l'organisation de cette réunion et les différents intervenants pour leur présentation. Dans les presque 3 ans que dure sa guerre d'agression illégale contre l'Ukraine, la Russie a commis d'innombrables violations du droit international humanitaire à l'encontre des prisonniers de guerre ukrainiens. La mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies en Ukraine a établi que le recours à la torture à l'encontre des prisonniers de guerre ukrainiens était massif et systématique. Ils subissent aussi des traitements inhumains et dégradants, privation de nourriture, isolement, absence de soins médicaux, violences sexuelles. La haute-commissaire adjointe aux droits de l'homme a encore appelé le 8 janvier la Russie à mettre un terme aux exécutions sommaires de prisonniers ukrainiens, rappelant qu'elles étaient constitutives de crimes de guerre. Nous exhortons la Russie à se conformer au droit international humanitaire et à permettre aux acteurs humanitaires d'accéder aux prisonniers de guerre, y compris ceux placés en captivité en Russie. La France salue la mobilisation de plusieurs États, y compris l'Arabie saoudite, les Émirats arabes unis et le Vatican, en vue d'obtenir la libération des prisonniers de guerre. La libération de tous les prisonniers de guerre ukrainiens fait partie des conditions d'une paix juste et durable. Elle figure dans le plan de paix du président Zelensky, auquel la France réitère son soutien. Nous saluons à cet égard la tenue fin octobre à Montréal de la conférence ministérielle de la dimension humaine de la formule de paix. Monsieur le Président, nous appelons la Russie à mettre un terme aux détentions arbitraires de civils ukrainiens. La grande majorité des civils ukrainiens détenus par la Russie ne sont jamais informés des motifs de leur détention et n'ont aucune possibilité de contester la légalité de leur détention. Cette pratique de privation arbitraire de liberté à grande échelle, documentée par l'OSCE, s'accompagne de nombreux cas de disparition forcée, de violences sexuelles et de mauvais traitements. Les organisations humanitaires doivent pouvoir accéder immédiatement et sans entrave à ces populations. La France condamne la détention et le transfert forcé ou la déportation d'enfants ukrainiens que la Russie soumet à une politique d'acculturation forcée, à l'endoctrinement et à la formation militaire. Nous exigeons qu'elle rende les enfants ukrainiens à leurs familles, leurs tuteurs légaux et leur communauté. Monsieur le Président, les crimes de guerre commis en Ukraine ne doivent pas rester impunis. Le travail de la commission d'enquête internationale et indépendante sur l'Ukraine est à ce titre indispensable. Nous rappelons notre soutien à la Cour pénale internationale et aux juridictions ukrainiennes dans la lutte contre l'impunité. La France salue l'aboutissement, le 25 octobre dernier, du processus de ratification par l'Ukraine du statut de Rome. La France continuera d'aider l'Ukraine aussi intensément et aussi longtemps que nécessaire afin que la guerre d'agression de la Russie soit mise en échec et qu'un règlement juste et durable du conflit soit possible. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，乌克兰危机仍在延宕，人道局势持续恶化，外溢效应不断扩散，战事造成大量人员伤亡，令人深感痛心。中方再次呼吁冲突当事方保持冷静克制，严格遵守国际法，特别是国际人道法，避免袭击平民和民用基础设施。根据日内瓦第3公约规定，战俘有权享有人道待遇，免遭酷刑、虐待等伤害。中方发布的关于政治解决乌克兰危机的立场文件也明确提出，要保护平民和战俘，应尊重战俘基本权利。我们呼吁冲突双方严格遵守相关国际法，切实尊重战俘基本权利。我们欢迎俄罗斯和乌克兰多次交换战俘，赞赏阿联酋等国为此做出的斡旋努力，以及红十字国际委员会为探视战俘、协助收集失踪人员信息所做工作。希望冲突双方在换俘问题上继续展现积极政治意愿，相向而行，为早日开启和谈积累条件。主席，战争没有赢家，冲突没有未来。早日停火止战，寻求政治解决，最符合各方利益。在当前形势下，国际社会各方都应以和平为重，以人道为重，共同壮大劝和促谈的合力，寻求危机的全面持久解决。我们呼吁有的安理会成员停止利用危机推进自身地缘战略，真正为促进和平做出努力。中方将继续秉持客观公正立场，同有关各方保持接触沟通，为推动政治解决乌克兰危机做出不懈努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. Mr. Chair, Somalia welcomes the permanent mission of the United Kingdom and co-sponsors for convening this Arria-formula meeting. We express appreciation for the briefs about their presentations on the situation of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees. We take note of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry's report and merits our careful consideration. The treatment of prisoners of war and civilian detainees remains a fundamental concern for international community. Such matters touch upon core principles of international humanitarian law and the obligations all states have undertaken through the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols. The protection of those in detention during armed conflict represents one of the most basic duties under international law. These obligations are not optional. They reflect minimum standards of human treatment that must be guaranteed in all circumstances. The International Committee of the Red Cross plays an essential role in monitoring detention conditions, and facilitating humanitarian access. Their mandate to visit prisoners of war must be fully respected, and unrestricted access should be granted to all detention facilities without delay. We note with interest the recent developments under the Montreal Pledge, which outline practical steps for addressing these humanitarian challenges. This framework provides a constructive basis for improving conditions and facilitating the release of detainees through diplomatic channels. We call on all parties to ensure full compliance with international humanitarian law and provide immediate and unimpeded access to the ICRC for their constructive engagement in prisoner exchanges. It is also critical to strengthen dialogue through established international mechanisms and implement agreed humanitarian measures without delay. The path forward requires renewed commitment to diplomatic solutions and respect for international legal obligations. Through constructive dialogue and adherence to established humanitarian principles, we can ensure the protection of all detainees. We stand ready to support efforts towards peaceful resolution of these issues through appropriate diplomatic channels and international mechanisms. We must work collectively to uphold the principle that protect those affected by the conflict in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the briefers for their remarks. Mr. Chair, it has been 3 years since the war in Ukraine broke out, and yet the situation on the ground remains deeply concerning in both parts of the Ukrainian-Russian borders. We have consistently condemned the killing of civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, including critical energy facilities, and called both parties to uphold their commitments under the international law, including the International Humanitarian Law, and to prioritize the protection of civilians. Under the customary international humanitarian law, prisoners of war must be allowed protection and all rights. In this regard, it is critical for both parties to strictly abide by the obligations under the Geneva Conventions, especially the Third Geneva Convention, as well as other relevant treaties. Under this legal framework, prisoners of war must at all times be humanely treated and be entitled to respect for their persons and their honor. Women shall be treated with all the regard due to their status. In the meantime, the role of relevant international actors remain critical and should be unhindered. Moreover, it is vital to encourage the increase the exchange of prisoners of war between the parties to alleviate the prisoners' suffering and reunite them with their families and loved ones. In this vein, the efforts undertaken to facilitate the swap of hundreds of prisoners of war, which resulted in the liberation of thousands of prisoners from Ukraine or Russia, are commendable and should be strengthened. These deals should inspire both parties to favor dialogue and negotiations in order to reach a just and lasting solution in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and taking into account their security concerns. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Chair. The convening of this Arria-formula meeting by the United Kingdom and co-sponsored by Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and the United States provides an invaluable opportunity for the UN Security Council members and participating UN member states to reaffirm commitment to international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and the protection of human dignity in conflict, especially the treatment of prisoners of war. Let me thank Mr. Pablo de Graef, member of the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, Senior Sergeant Valery Horishny of the National Guard of Ukraine, Mr. Maxim Butkevich, and Mr. Nariman Dejeal for their presentations. Sierra Leone, owing to our own experience, deeply understand the cruelty and inhumanity of war, and we therefore reinforce the centrality of adhering to international law, especially the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, which form the core framework for the protection of prisoners of war. The treatment of prisoners of war is clearly defined in Geneva Convention, the Third Geneva Convention, to which both Russia and Ukraine are parties. This treaty articulates fundamental rights of prisoners of war, ensuring that they are always treated humanely without exception. These rights include protection against torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, as well as access to adequate food, shelter, medical care, and the ability to communicate with their families. Civilian detainees are similarly protected from abuse and mistreatment under the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 and Additional Protocol 1, and international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Since the onset of the conflict in Ukraine in 2022, reports issued on the human rights situation by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as by other international and regional bodies, have presented a grim picture of widespread torture and abuse of prisoners of war and civilian detainees. POWs and civilian detainees have been subjected to sexual violence, beatings, stress positions, electric shocks, strangulation, prolonged solitary confinement, and deprivation of food, water, and sleep, among others. Women detainees are equally subjected to torture and ill treatment. These reported incidents of abuse are in clear violation of the safeguards and protections afforded under international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone condemns all violations of the applicable Geneva Convention and additional protocol in the treatment of POWs and civilian detainees in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Chair, in advancing the dialogue on this issue, we wish to emphasize the following 3 points. First, and on a positive note, Sierra Leone commends the recent prisoner exchange between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, which saw the release of hundreds of captives, including military personnel and civilians, in a significant step towards alleviating the humanitarian impact of the conflict. This exchange, which resulted in the freedom of 189 Ukrainians, including border and national guards, alongside 2 civilians and 150 Russian soldiers. We therefore extend our thanks and appreciation to the UAE for its diplomatic efforts in brokering this agreement, reflecting the importance of international collaboration in addressing such critical issues. Second, and in noting the independent and credible reports evidencing the objectionable treatment of captured fighters in the Ukraine conflict, including by the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, in 4 comprehensive annual reports since 2022, as well as the reports issued by OHCHR on the human rights situation in the Ukraine conflict, appropriate responses and actions are warranted from the international community. Third, Sierra Leone calls for the perpetrators of abuse of POWs and civilian detainees in the conflict to be fully held accountable for their gross violation of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. We support the recommendations in the OHCHR report for the prompt, impartial, and effective investigations into all alleged violations of IHL and IRHL, including military action causing excessive civilian harm. In conflict situations, viewing each other as enemies rather than fellow human beings, it is particularly important that the rules of war established by the International Humanitarian Law and to which the Security Council has affirmed and all countries have agreed are upheld. As we call for the parties to the conflict to make all possible efforts to minimize civilian harm, it is equally important that the people who violate the agreed rules of war and inflict harm on those who have been categorized as POWs and other detainees are held accountable to avoid impunity. Accountability also means support for POWs and civilian detainees who are victims of abuse and torture, including ensuring their claims are fully investigated, they receive medical and psychosocial support, as well as relevant legal support in responding to the deplorable acts of their perpetrators. We especially call for the protection of female POWs and detainees who are being reportedly subjected to sexual violence. In conclusion, Chair, Sierra Leone calls on all parties to seek and pursue political dialogue, as military means alone will not achieve the political objective of the conflict in Ukraine. The conflict has been going on for 3 years, and there is seemingly no end in sight. As we urge for dialogue, we further remind the conflicting parties of their obligations to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Sierra Leone. We will now hear from other UN member states who wish to speak who are not members of the Security Council. We give the floor to the permanent representative of Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I extend my gratitude to the permanent mission of the United Kingdom and all co-sponsors for organizing this long-awaited discussion. I am particularly thankful to the distinguished briefers Pablo de Grief, Nariman Jalal, Maxim Butkevich, and Valery Kharichny. I commend the Commission of Inquiry for its unwavering dedication to fulfilling its mandate, even in the face of budgetary constraints. I urge the Secretariat and the Security Council to take due note of the Commission's findings and conclusions and integrate them into the Council's activities. The harrowing testimonies from the Ukrainian briefers, which we've just heard, confirm that the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia are not isolated incidents, but systematic practices endorsed at all levels of Russian leadership. All Ukrainians are their targets, be they military or civilians, men or women, children or elderly. Less than a week ago, on January 8, Russia again demonstrated its adherence to this inhumane modus operandi. 13 civilians were killed and 127 were wounded by the aerial bombs that Russia dropped on a crowded street of the city of Zaporizhia. As the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine reported, this heinous attack caused the highest number of civilian casualties in a single incident in almost 2 years. If Russia shows no hesitation in openly committing such blatant murders, we can only imagine the true scale of the crimes against Ukrainians in captivity. We regularly draw the Council's attention to video evidence of Ukrainian soldiers executed after surrendering as captured by drones. The most recent murder was recorded on January the 3rd near the village of Vremivka, Volnovakha district, where Russian forces captured 2 Ukrainian servicemen, executed them at close range, and fired additional shots to ensure their deaths. The Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine is investigating the execution of 202 Ukrainian POWs. The true number is likely much higher. A critical issue that remains is Russia's incommunicado detention of Ukrainian civilians and military personnel, denying access to UN and ICRC representatives. The ungrounded persecution and detention of civilians is a clear violation of IHL, and all such detained civilians must be unconditionally released. Ukraine, by contrast, grants unhindered access to its detention facilities, adhering to IHL and demonstrating a commitment to civilized norms. We urge the UN Security Council and all responsible member states to demand that Russia cease the torture and ill treatment of Ukrainian POWs and detainees. Humanitarian and human rights mechanisms must be granted immediate and unrestricted access to ensure humane treatment and safe repatriation. I would like to remind you that last October, this call was reiterated by participants of the Montreal Ministerial Conference on the Human Dimension of the Peace Formula. The repatriation of seriously ill and severely wounded POWs, as mandated by the Geneva Convention, also requires urgent action. While Ukraine has taken all the required steps to establish mixed medical commissions for this purpose, Russia has done nothing, thus demonstrating its disregard for the health and return of its own soldiers. Russia's open defiance of international law must end. It is imperative to ensure accountability for Russia's crimes and justice for the victims. A strong stance from you here at the United Nations is crucial. Those of you who supported our resolutions on the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories in 2021-2023 joined the demand to release Nariman Jalal, as this demand was a part of those documents. Each of you contributed to his release, and his presence here stands as a powerful evidence of the practical impact of our collective efforts at the United Nations. I urge you to continue backing all relevant initiatives on the UN platform aimed at halting these Russian crimes. As you see, they are not abstract policies. They represent the hopes and lives of real individuals who are now suffering and thus require our action and our protection. We have previously brought to the Council's attention how Russian recruits trained to operate attacking drones by targeting and killing innocent civilians in the streets of the city of Kherson. In Russian schools, war criminals are holding lessons for Russian children, encouraging them to learn how to kill Ukrainians. It comes as no surprise that the Russian Foreign Ministry is following this trend, training its diplomats across the globe, including here in New York, to disseminate lies and maintain smear campaigns. Producing fakes about Azov Brigade has been among the main tools of Russian propaganda since 2014. The full-scale war has ultimately revealed the truth. Soldiers of the Azov Brigade were among the courageous defenders of Mariupol in 2022, staying in the besieged city and protecting its residents, who Russia killed on an industrial scale until the very end. Russia, in turn, has fully adopted the practices of the Third Reich, ranging from the annexation of sovereign territories and the razing of Ukrainian cities to the ground, to the deliberate execution of Ukrainian POWs and civilians. That's why if Russian diplomats are truly eager to combat neo-Nazism, they might start by calling their own Russian Ministry of Defense. They may ask, for instance, about the Rusich unit, which operates as part of the Russian army. Its members openly embrace their neo-Nazi views, and their commander, Sergeant Milchakov, openly declares, and I quote, "I'm a Nazi. I speak about it directly. I can even raise a hand in Nazi greeting." In fact, let me try to use the original.
Нацист. Я нацист. Я не буду углубляться. Националист, там, патриот, имперское направление и так далее. Я прямо говорю, я нацист.
His subordinates are just like their commander. They could play with the severed head of a prisoner, boasting about it in interviews, or post ads on social media seeking a Crimean Tatar for ritual sacrifice, and then brag about carrying out such a ritual. This is just one of many examples illustrating how war crimes and crimes against humanity have become standard practice for the Russian army. Responsibility for these is inevitable, and I urge the Russian mission, both its leadership and junior diplomats, to keep this in mind. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. We extend our gratitude to the delegations of the United Kingdom, United States, and Ukraine for convening this important meeting, which we are glad to co-sponsor. We sincerely thank the briefers for sharing their invaluable perspectives. Their testimonies are deeply distressing and shed light on the brutal violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law by the Russian Federation. This meeting on violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees, as well as numerous other meetings addressing the suffering of Ukrainian civilians, portray the harsh reality of the consequences of Russia's war aggression against Ukraine. Russia's use of military aggression and committing war atrocities, including the heinous treatments of the prisoners of war and civilians, follow the pattern of Soviet crimes against many states and nations, including the Baltic states. Today, we commemorate events of 1991, the very last year of Soviet Union's existence, when on January 13th, 1991, armed Soviet forces encircled and stormed the television tower and building in Vilnius, and on January 20th, attacked the Ministry of Interior in Riga. 20 people were killed, and thousands have been injured and traumatized by these brutal attacks. We will never forget those who sacrificed their lives for our freedom, and will continue seeking full accountability for those who have committed those crimes. Mr. President, according to the findings of the OSCE, Human Rights Council, and Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, the torture of civilians and prisoners of war from Ukraine by Russia is both widespread and systematic. In its last report, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded that Russian authorities have acted pursuant to a policy encouraging torture against civilian and prisoners of war, and have thereby committed torture as a crime against humanity. Furthermore, war crime of torture has been committed in the context of detention, often in conjunction with other crimes and human rights violations, such as unlawful confinement, willful killings, sexual and gender-based violence, and denial of medical assistance. Extensive sexual violence as a brutal form of torture has been prevalent in detention facilities controlled by the Russian authorities, and the general absence or denial of medical assistance in such context is a commonly observed issue. In this regard, we call on Russia to implement the United Nations standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the so-called Mandela rules. by respecting the dignity and rights of the detainees and ensuring access to adequate medical assistance. Point-blank execution of prisoners of war is another crime that shows no sign of slowing down. According to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, there are currently over 53 criminal investigations on the execution of at least 177 Ukrainian soldiers, most of them occurring in 2024. This constitutes a war crime under the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute. All those committing such crimes should be held fully accountable. We demand that Russia grants unhindered access to all UN human rights special procedures mandate holders, including the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, in accordance with its obligations under International Humanitarian Law. We call for a more active role of the International Committee of the Red Cross and urge Russia to ensure access for their representatives to detention facilities. We also encourage World Health Organization working with the UN and such NGOs as Doctors Without Borders to develop rehabilitation programs for former prisoners of war to support their recovery. Mr. President, this imperialist war of aggression should never have been started by Russia, and the prisoners of war and civilian detainees should never have been taken. Sadly, confronted by the situation, we commend and welcome the efforts and assistance of many member states, lately of the United Arab Emirates, who have contributed to and facilitated negotiations on prisoners' exchange. We also positively acknowledge the announcement of the preliminary agreement on systematic prisoner exchanges, starting this year with priority to return seriously ill and wounded soldiers. We call on Russia to implement this arrangement, while our utmost priority remains that Russia withdraw its troops from the internationally recognized territories of Ukraine, respects the UN Charter, and ends this war of aggression. Building on the Baltic states' ongoing medical, psychological, and other support provided to wounded soldiers and civilians, which last year amounted to over 100 million euros, we stand ready to assist Ukraine in facilitating the return to Ukraine of prisoners of war, illegally deported children, and unlawfully detained civilians. We will continue supporting Ukraine's peace formula as the only viable way to restore just and lasting peace. We will stand with Ukraine until its victory in our joint resolve to end Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression, and to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Finally, it is ironic that at the same time as the Russian ambassador is inviting UN member states to reception dedicated to the World War II blockade of Leningrad, Russia's aggressors' forces are encircling Ukraine town Pokrovsk. This only illustrates Russia's manipulative and selective interpretation of history, attempting to divert the attention from their aggression against Ukraine. And so was the statement of the Russian representative today. We reiterate a call on Russia to respect its obligations under international law, including the UN Charter, as well as international humanitarian law and human rights law, and to cease its war of aggression against Ukraine immediately. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of Lithuania for their statement on behalf of the Baltic states. We give the floor to the representative of the European Union.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, aligned themselves with this statement. Like others, please allow me to congratulate the organizers of this initiative and thank you as well to the briefers for their courageous testimonies. Colleagues, there's much to be said about Russia's violations of international law and disregard, blatant disregard for human life, as part of its illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. Indeed, Russia's illegal actions have been thoroughly documented by the United Nations and others, from its large-scale and systematic attacks against civilians in Ukraine and energy infrastructure, to the large-scale human rights violations in the territories it currently temporarily occupies. But today's meeting rightly draws our attention to the inhumane treatment and plight of two groups of people in a particularly vulnerable situation who enjoy protection under international law: Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees. The UN's Independent Commission of Inquiry has concluded that Russian authorities committed crimes against humanity through a coordinated state policy of systematic and widespread use of torture across their detention facilities. There is a disturbing rise in reports of executions of Ukrainian service persons captured by Russian forces, as we all heard today as well. Since February 22, OHCHR has verified the summary execution of 170 civilians, including in places of detention, and 68 prisoners of war. We condemn in the strongest terms the use of torture, ill treatment, and killing of POWs and civilian detainees. These are abhorrent acts. The European Union also condemns prisoners' lack of access to basic needs, such as medical care, food and water, as well as the denial of access for the ICRC and other independent monitors to assess their conditions in captivity and to reconnect them with their families. International humanitarian law, dear colleagues, including the Third and Fourth Geneva Conventions, must be upheld. Russia must ensure unimpeded access to the ICRC and human rights monitoring mechanisms to prisoners of war, both in temporary occupied territories and in detention facilities in Russia itself. These actions further highlight that Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging this war of aggression and for other crimes under international law. Impunity emboldens violators and perpetuates cycles of violence. That's why so many people in this room again today spoke about no impunity. Colleagues, the blatant violations against civilian detainees and POWs are not taking place, of course, in a vacuum. Russia's continuous violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and its attempts to acquire territory through the use of force, let's be clear, concern every single UN member state. We again urge the UN members to seize any and all assistance to Russia's war of aggression and to speak up in defense of international law and the UN Charter. Protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all UN member states, regardless of their size or relative power, and especially if they are smaller and not as powerful. It is a collective duty. So as the temperature drops below zero, our thoughts go out to the prisoners of war and civilian detainees. We commend efforts to bring them home, and we hope that they will soon be united with their loved ones. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of the European Union for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Chair, for initiating and for co-convening this very important meeting, not the least thanks to all the briefers, including very powerful testimonies. I have the honor to delivering this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and my own country, Norway. For almost 3 years, thousands of Ukrainians have found themselves in Russian captivity. For more than 1,000 days, families have been waiting for news about their loved ones, not knowing whether they are dead or alive. This inflicts terrible harm on the civilian population, on top of bombings and other targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure. For more than 1,000 days, 3 OSCE employees have been held in Russian captivity, illustrating Russia's lack of respect for the mandate of international organizations. We are witnessing numerous blatant violations of international law by Russia, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Russia demonstrates a profound lack of respect for the Geneva Conventions, which Russia has ratified. Russia also shows little respect for ICRC's mandate. Access to both civilian detainees and prisoners of war has been very limited. The whereabouts and the conditions of many Ukrainians remain unknown. Those lucky enough to return have confirmed that most Ukrainians in Russian captivity are exposed to ill treatment and torture. This includes severe beatings, electric shocks, strangulation, and prolonged solitary confinement. Most frequently reported is the use of sexual violence, including rape and forced nudity. The UN Commission of Inquiry findings confirm that Russian authorities use torture in a widespread and systematic way. The findings led the Commission to conclude that the Russian authorities' use of torture amounts to crimes against humanity. Since Russia's full-scale invasion started, there have been horrifying reports of summary executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war. And according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, this is a trend that is increasing. So far, they have verified executions of 68 Ukrainian prisoners of war and service personnel de combat. Such acts are violations of international humanitarian law, not least the Geneva Conventions. Respecting and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law is an obligation of all states. Today, the support provided to Ukraine comes in many shapes and forms. Some states are offering their good offices to broker humanitarian exchanges, and it has made a huge difference in many lives. It proves that practical engagement matters. This was also clearly expressed recently in the joint pledge in Montreal, 1st of November last year, by 49 member states, including all the Nordic member states. For every day that passes by, Ukrainians are at risk of being captured, at risk of being tortured, and at risk of being executed or dying in detention. IHL must be respected, and this Council carries a great responsibility in upholding international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Chair, for convening this meeting. And I express sincere gratitude to the 4 briefers for their sobering briefings, especially for courageously sharing their such painful experiences. In the nearly 3 years since Russia launched its unprovoked and unjustifiable aggression against Ukraine, the very principles of the UN Charter have been continually and systematically violated. Japan remains profoundly troubled by and reiterates its strongest condemnation against Russia's clear and persistent disregard of international humanitarian law, including the International Commission of Inquiry's grave findings on the use of torture. Japan strongly condemns the widespread and systematic nature of the use of torture, including sexual violence as a form of torture, carried out against both Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, and committed openly with an apparent sense of impunity by Russian authorities. Any acts of war crimes, and violations of human rights must be met with accountability. As the General Assembly Resolution 79/184 urges, Russia must provide reliable information on the whereabouts of detained Ukrainian citizens, including prisoners of war, and release all residents of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine who have been unlawfully arrested or detained. Japan also strongly condemns the child abductions by Russia and urges Russia to repatriate abducted children immediately. Those found to be responsible for human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian rights law and international humanitarian law must be held accountable before the independent, impartial judiciary. Chair, in conclusion, Japan reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with the Ukrainian people and will continue to stand by Ukraine. Japan is firmly committed to supporting the achievement of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace rooted in the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Canada.
I thank the UK and the briefers today, especially Valérie, Nariman, and Maxime, for sharing their horrifying experiences. We commend your courage and your resilience. Comme nous l'avons entendu aujourd'hui, des rapports réguliers et fiables ont démontré que la conduite des forces russes à l'égard des personnes détenues n'était rien de moins que barbare. La torture, les exécutions sommaires, la violence sexuelle et les autres formes de traitement inhumain auxquels la Russie a soumis les Ukrainiens capturés sont des affronts à la dignité humaine et à la justice. Nous ne pouvons pas fermer les yeux sur les dangereux précédents créés pour les conflits futurs en violation flagrante du droit humanitaire international. Il est impératif que la communauté internationale continue à maintenir et à défendre les principes clés qui sous-tendent le droit international humanitaire et le droit international des droits de la personne, et évite de créer des nouveaux précédents où la torture et la violence sexuelle deviendraient la norme. Last October, Canada, alongside Norway and Ukraine, hosted the Ministerial Conference on the Human Dimension of Ukraine's Peace Formula in Montreal. This conference addressed the return of prisoners of war, unlawfully detained civilians, and deported or forcibly transferred children. It also highlighted the significant immediate and long-term support that returned detainees will need, as so powerfully described by our briefers today. I am proud to share that in a collective commitment to take concrete action against this inhumane treatment, 54 states have endorsed the Montreal Pledge, a collective commitment to share information about detainees, ensure lawful releases, and maintain fair and humane treatment. We invite all member states to endorse the Montreal Pledge and commit to standing against widespread torture and mistreatment. Mr. Chair, Canada stands firmly with Ukraine and the international community in demanding that Russia comply with international humanitarian law. We call for full and unimpeded access for human rights mechanisms to monitor the conditions faced by Ukrainian POWs and, importantly, civilian detainees to ensure fair and humane treatment. Canada will continue to condemn Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of aggression against Ukraine and will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Canada for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Australia to be followed by the representative of Liechtenstein. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank the United Kingdom for bringing this important matter to the Security Council. We're deeply moved and appalled by the testimonies we have received today from our briefers. Australia reiterates our profound concern at reports that the Russian Federation is violating the most fundamental principles of international humanitarian law in relation to the treatment of Ukrainian civilian detainees and prisoners of war. We're especially concerned by the scale of reported summary executions. Where confirmed, these would be an egregious example of the breach by the Russian Federation of its most basic obligations. We're also appalled by the reported use of sexual violence as a form of torture and, more broadly, condemn the inhumane, degrading and unsanitary conditions so many detainees endure. We call on the Russian Federation to treat all prisoners of war with dignity and in accordance with international humanitarian law. We reiterate calls for the ICRC and other independent international monitors to have full access to all those areas of Ukraine controlled by Russia, and especially all places of detention. The Russian Federation must end this illegal and immoral law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We are grateful to the United Kingdom and all co-sponsors for convening this timely event on the fate of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees and the gross violations of international humanitarian and human rights law they have experienced. In line with the reports by the UN Commission of Inquiry, the military aggression against Ukraine has been accompanied by widespread and systematic use of torture by Russian authorities in areas under their control. We are deeply concerned by these findings, including with regards to the prevalence of the use of sexual violence as a form of torture in detention facilities. Sexual violence sadly continues to be a widespread pattern in armed conflict around the globe, and women and girls continue to be disproportionately affected. In certain circumstances, particularly in detention settings, however, men can be strongly affected and even make up the majority of victims. Due to the shame and stigma, as well as harmful assumptions about male vulnerability to such forms of violence, these crimes often go underreported. In Resolution 2467, the Security Council specifically recognized that detention settings are a key context of vulnerability for men and boys to conflict-related sexual violence. And according to the Commission of Inquiry, most prisoners of war detained by Russian authorities have reported being subject to sexual violence. Mr. Chair, access to justice and health care remains a significant challenge for all victims and survivors of torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment in the context of deprivation of liberty. There is an urgent need to strengthen survivor-centered responses, ensuring documentation efforts are guided by the need of victims and survivors and focus on addressing and repairing the harm caused. Among those who suffer sexual violence, male survivors face gender-specific barriers, including stigma and cultural taboos, along with norms around masculinities, as well as the absence of trained and sensitized justice sector actors. Our partners from the Liechtenstein-based NGO All Survivors Project are dedicated to ensuring that those who suffer these crimes receive appropriate mental health and psychosocial support for the recovery and are equipped to engage in national and international accountability processes. In so doing, they also engage in improving awareness and sensitivity about these crimes, as well as offering targeted training for key stakeholders. Mr. Chair, conflict-related sexual violence is prohibited in all circumstances under international law. Obligations to prevent, monitor, investigate, and hold perpetrators accountable for sexual violence stem from this universal prohibition. We are grateful for the crucial work of international, national, and civil society actors to collect vast amounts of evidence for use in criminal proceedings to put an end to impunity for these outrageous violations. In this regard, we also commend Ukraine's ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as a further important step to ensuring accountability for crimes committed in the context of the aggression against the country. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. Chair, I would like to thank the United Kingdom and the co-sponsoring states for organizing this important meeting and for all the briefers for the insightful, strong and disturbing testimonies. Last year, the international community commemorated the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, the cornerstone of the international humanitarian law and a testament to the fact that even wars have a rules, or one should say they should have a rules. As a party to the Geneva Conventions, Russia is legally obligated to comply with all the provisions, including those of the Third Geneva Convention, concerning the protection of prisoners of war and the humanitarian access of the ICRC. Under the Third Geneva Conventions, it is the detaining power that is always responsible for the treatment of the prisoners of war regardless of the individual responsibility of those who committed the crimes. Mr. Chair, we thank the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine for its tireless work in bringing to the light the horrific crimes committed by Russia during its illegal aggression. We are deeply alarmed by the findings regarding the fate of the Ukrainian POWs and civilian detainees, including reports of beatings, electric shock, sexual violence, and mock executions, and the real ones. We condemn Russia's widespread and systematic use of torture, a crime against humanity. At the same time, we positively note the Ukrainians' commitment and efforts in striving to uphold its obligations under the international law concerning POWs. It's a kind of appalling difference. Furthermore, we are gravely troubled by the persecution of the Crimean Tatar community, who face grave human rights violations at the hands of the occupying authorities. This latest report exposes Russian conduct rooted in the wider culture of aggression, systematic violence, and the state-sanctioned war crimes. It demonstrates a devaluation of human life and disregard for international law. Russia's actions repeatedly place it outside the community of nations grounded in the values of the UN Charter. Mr. Chair, Poland calls on Russia to end its ill treatment and executions in occupied Ukrainian territories, allow humanitarian access, and facilitate the release of prisoners. We remain committed to holding all perpetrators of Russian war crimes accountable. Violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law must not go unpunished, and justice must be delivered to the victims. Finally, we urge all the nations to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia's attempt to strip it of its sovereignty and subjugate its people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. I'd like to give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank the United Kingdom and other involved missions for this valuable initiative and the opportunity to address you all today. And I would like to start by thanking the briefers for their compelling testimonies. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is deeply alarmed by Russia's treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Reports by OHCHR and the Commission of Inquiry have confirmed systematic human rights abuses, including torture and sexual violence, as well as crimes against humanity. I'd like to highlight 4 areas on which the international community should take concrete steps with encouragement by this Council. First, the collection of data. Second, the localization of detainees. Third, reintegration. And fourth, combating impunity. On the first point, we must continue collecting and verifying data on civilians unlawfully detained. The reports of international organizations like the Commission of Inquiry are crucial in this regard. Their work remains indispensable. Second, it is essential to get more clarity on the location where the prisoners of war and civilians are held by Russia. The Kingdom of the Netherlands unequivocally supports the International Committee of the Red Cross in gaining unfettered access to places of detention and maintaining family connections for detainees. Third, when civilians and prisoners of war return, they must be supported in their reintegration in society. And as an example, the Kingdom of the Netherlands has supported mental health and psychosocial support initiatives with 10 million euros and will continue to do so through the World Health Organization. And lastly, the latest developments in Ukraine underline the importance of combating impunity for international crimes and large-scale human rights violations and supporting Ukraine's path towards accountability. As also reported by OHCHR, accountability is essential in preventing further violations. As the lead nation on restoring justice for Ukraine, the Kingdom of the Netherlands is determined to hold accountable all perpetrators of international crimes in Russia's war against Ukraine. In conclusion, it's up to this Council to underline the importance of adhering to specific rules of international humanitarian law, intended to protect prisoners of war and civilian detainees from experiencing the horrors they have to go through on a daily basis. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Netherlands for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Croatia.
Chair, distinguished colleagues, Croatia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union, and I would like to add some remarks in my national capacity. I thank the organizers for convening this important meeting and the briefers for sharing their testimonies. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has not only caused immense destruction and displacement, but has also been marked by grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has consistently reported on the inhumane treatment of Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war by Russian authorities. The systemic use of torture, including through sexual violence and denying medical assistance to detainees, manifests cruelty and a direct attack on human dignity. Recent findings have confirmed that such widespread and coordinated state policies of abuse amount to crimes against humanity. Croatia condemns all the crimes committed and calls for Russian authorities to end the aggression and violence against civilians and prisoners of war. The respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law must come as a priority, including through granting humanitarian organizations and human rights monitoring mechanisms full access to detainees. We also underline the importance of accountability. Identifying and prosecuting perpetrators is crucial for preventing future violations and building lasting peace. It is also a vital part of restoring dignity and justice to the victims. A comprehensive approach providing all survivors with dedicated medical and psychosocial support is essential. This alarming situation caused by Russia's violations of international law calls for greater attention and coordinated action of the international community, including within the framework of the Security Council. Unlawfully detained civilians should be urgently released, and prisoners of war should be treated with respect to the Geneva Conventions. Croatia stands firm in supporting Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as all international efforts that contribute to securing a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Croatia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to thank you for organizing this meeting, you and the co-sponsors. I also want to thank the briefers. In addition to the statement delivered by the European Union, I want to add a few points in an abbreviated form. We are now a month before the 3 years mark since the start of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And this meeting as well is a very strong reminder that we must not lose sight of what is happening in Ukraine. We are appalled by the continued reports of all crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russian forces in its war of aggression against Ukraine. And the international community has credible and detailed information from the most recent report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine on the extent of the violations inflicted against Ukrainians. And the Commission has sufficient evidence to determine that, quote, that the Russian authorities have acted pursuant to a coordinated state policy to torture Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, and to conclude that Russian authorities have committed crimes against humanity of torture in the context of their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In addition, for over 2 mandates, the Commission has consistently found that Russian authorities have used torture as a war crime and the corresponding human rights violation against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. And the evidence is solid. It is also backed up by reports from the OHCHR of torture and of summary executions of prisoners of war. And we cannot and must not remain silent. The Russian Federation must stop its reprehensible and unlawful behavior towards Ukrainian civilian detainees and prisoners of war, and fully comply to its obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. It is also imperative to grant unrestricted access to the representatives of the ICRC to visit civilian detainees and prisoners of war. We also recall that the ICC continues to have jurisdiction over all the crimes under its purview committed in Ukraine. The arrest warrants issued by the court remain unexecuted, and we extend our unconditional support to the ICC and its independence. And the court must be able to continue its work without threats or sanctions against
it or its officials. Full accountability is necessary for all atrocities committed in and against Ukraine, and the unified and continued support of the international community for this righteous goal remains essential. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to thank the representative of Romania for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Austria.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And Austria also aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union earlier. We also want to thank you for organizing this event on a topic that requires the Council's thorough attention and for the briefers for their presentations. As many have stated today, we're nearing the completion of a third year of Russia's unprovoked, unjustified and illegal full-scale aggression against its neighbor, Ukraine. Over the past years, we've seen terrible consequences for the civilian population and the natural environment, as well as unspeakable human suffering. Today, we therefore do not gather only as diplomats, but also as custodians of our shared humanity. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be upheld anywhere and at all times. This is true for Ukraine, the Middle East, and other parts of the world where conflicts rage. The accounts brought forward by the Commission of Inquiry, the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE, and the testimonies that we heard today expose a harrowing truth. The widespread, systematic use of torture by Russian authorities against prisoners of war and civilian detainees, amounting to crimes against humanity, as well as the summary execution of POWs. The evidence is both shocking and unequivocal. Let me be clear, we condemn in the strongest possible terms the use of torture, ill treatment, and killing of POWs and civilian detainees. The international community has an obligation to act in the face of these crimes. Three things should happen now. The international community should continue to lend its support to independent accountability mechanisms such as the UN's Commission of Inquiry. Austria will continue to do its part as host country of the Commission. Second, there can be no peace without justice. Accountability must not be limited to documenting crimes. They must be investigated and perpetrators held to account. We fully support all efforts to do so, including by the International Criminal Court. Third, in the meantime, the ICRC and international human rights monitors must be granted full access to prisoners of war and civilian detainees by Russia in line with its international legal obligations. The Montreal Pledge and Ukraine's 10-point peace formula offer a pathway towards justice and reconciliation along these lines. Ukraine, like every independent state and member of the UN, is entitled to the stability and security of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, a peace based on international law and the UN Charter. We call on Russia to immediately end its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Austria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España se suma a la declaración realizada por la Unión Europea a título nacional. Deseamos reiterar una vez más nuestra más firme condena y profunda preocupación por las continuas violaciones del derecho internacional, incluido el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario, por parte de Rusia en Ucrania. Agradecemos los valientes testimonios que hemos oído en esta sesión que visibilizan la desgarradora situación de prisioneros de guerra y detenidos ucranianos tras más de 1000 días de agresión rusa. El último informe de la Comisión Independiente de Investigación para Ucrania documenta el trato inhumano a los prisioneros de guerra y detenidos civiles sometidos de forma sistemática a torturas. Las conclusiones de la Comisión reflejan graves violaciones de los convenios de Ginebra y confirman la comisión de crímenes de guerra por parte de las autoridades rusas. Condenamos enérgicamente estas actuaciones y hacemos un llamamiento urgente a Rusia para que garantice el acceso al Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja y otros mecanismos independientes para verificar la situación de los prisioneros ucranianos. Exigimos a Rusia, una vez más, que respete la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania dentro de sus fronteras internacionalmente reconocidas y que se retire de Ucrania de forma inmediata, completa e incondicional. Instamos a todos los miembros de la comunidad internacional a que cesen cualquier tipo de apoyo a la guerra de agresión rusa. Tenemos la responsabilidad colectiva de exigir rendición de cuentas a Rusia por sus crímenes de guerra y garantizar que se ponga fin a la impunidad. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Spain for their statement. Finally, I would like to invite Maxim Butkovich to make some brief concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. On behalf of my colleagues and myself, of course, I would like to thank all the parties, all the states who have shown their interest and came to attend this event and to voice their well-grounded position. To all of them, we are really grateful. I would, at the end, like to remind that we are talking about thousands, maybe dozens of thousands of people, both military and civilians, who are either detained in dozens of various places of detention all over Russia and occupied territories, and also thousands, if not dozens of thousands, of those who were disappeared and whose fate is currently unknown. Also, I would like to remind that when we talk about military, vast majority of Ukrainian military are civilians who were forced to wear military uniform, forced by the aggressor state, by Russian Federation. I myself served and was honored to command drivers and farmers and people who did manual work in peaceful time, but also teachers and actors who never wanted to go to the war, but they had to because they wanted to defend their freedom and they wanted to defend values which are the cornerstones of our society. These values we try to uphold even in this terrible time. This is why Ukraine, unlike the aggressor state, has positive experience in with regard to the Third Geneva Convention and cooperation with ICRC. The camps for Russian prisoners of war are accessible for international organizations and visited on a regular basis, and this is how actually Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights was able to interview them and get information, including the troublesome one, which was mentioned in the report, which was discussed today in brief. And Ukraine took it very seriously, reflected upon the situation and launched a criminal investigation in order to bring those responsible for human rights violations towards Russian POWs to justice. Nothing of this can be said about plight of Ukrainian POWs detained in Russian Federation. No access, no care, no responsibility. But things you could hear today. And unfortunately, such an attitude demonstrated by the Russian Federation towards international humanitarian law, we see that it makes it void, it makes it hollow and inefficient. So probably international humanitarian law needs not only care, but adaptation. We should learn lessons of this war, which Russian Federation wages not only against Ukraine, but in the form of hybrid war against all freer countries of the world. So I just hope that tragedy we're going through will be useful for all of us in order to make our world in the future safer for people, better place, and our international humanitarian law to be more efficient serving people around the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Butkovich. Mr. Pablo de Grief also would like to make some brief concluding remarks.
Very briefly, in the name of the International Commission of Inquiry, I would like to express my gratitude to all of those who have expressed recognition of the efforts that the Commission has made. The Commission takes its independence quite seriously, and in its reports, whenever the occasion has arisen, we have reported violations not just by the Russian Federation, but by Ukraine itself. Its work rests on very demanding standards of proof. We do not report on any testimony that is not independently verified. In the almost 3 years of its existence, it has interviewed more than 1,700 individuals, more than 50% of them women, and it has made 26 written requests for information to the Russian Federation, none of which have been answered. But I want to reiterate, we take our independence very seriously, and we do not cease in the hope of establishing meaningful communication with the Russian Federation, just as we have established with the Ukrainian government. I love and have deep respect for the assertion that was made that all member states are custodians of a shared humanity, and in our small fact-finding mission, we try to contribute to exercising a custodian over a shared humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Grief. Thank you to all of our briefers for their extremely powerful testimonials, for the evidence they have brought us today, evidence which I think is clear about the systematic ill treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civil detainees in detention by the Russian authorities. Many of you have reminded us today that the obligations to respect and protect prisoners of war, their human rights, is enshrined in international law, and that those obligations apply to all member states, and that includes the Russian Federation. So I thank you very much for your engagement, for coming today for a very important discussion. Thank you for being here, and that concludes our meeting for today. Thank you.